Hi everyone and welcome to GCAP. Firstly, I'd like to welcome you here. It's really nice to actually see everyone in person this year after a couple of years online going digital. And it's really good to see so many people come out to this talk and to the whole event here at the Melbourne Convention Centre. So my name's Amy Ellis and I'm an accountant from LDB Accountants and Advisors, and I'll just be facilitating this panel here today. So today we're here to talk to you about some of the tips and traps of starting out in development, in particular in regards to investment and starting out in your studio. So starting your own studio or dev team can certainly be a challenge, and one of the peak things that you're going to find in the early days is figuring out how on earth you're going to fund the game. So there's a few ways that you can do that, and that's what we're going to touch on today, and what some of the issues with that might be, or some of the advantages of doing it in a particular way. Today I'm joined by Luke Henry here. He's partner at LDB Accountants and Advisors, and we've also got Cam Rogers here from Cam Rogers Legal. So they're going to give us a bit of perspective from the tax side and also the legal side of structuring these types of investments. We did have a third member on our panel who has to send their apologies today. So Matt Ditton from Mighty Games Group was actually going to join us. Unfortunately, had to make a last-ditch trip overseas, so he won't be here today, but he does send his apologies. So to get us started, perhaps Luke, you could give us a bit of a background as to where you've come from, how you've come into games, and what you've seen.
Thanks, Amy. So I started doing some work in games about 20 odd years ago. It's hard to believe, isn't it? I look so young. Looking after a small team of guys had come out of university and started up Blue Tongue Entertainment. And from there we stuck with it. And it's been really great to see a host of different studios over the years develop and collapse sometimes and be bought out and go through the motions. And it's been a real learning experience for me.
And Cam?
Yeah, so I come from a traditional media background. I used to be a film producer in a former life and worked at a law firm in Melbourne called Marshalls and Dent, and was a film lawyer for ages until I saw the light about 10 years ago and decided to pivot into games and sort of haven't looked back. And just looking out here now, I can see a number of my clients. So yeah, don't keep me to my word, everybody.
Thank you for that. So one of the first things we want to talk about is actually getting started. So when you start up, you will often incorporate a company and perhaps raise some funds using share capital or something like that. So Luke, do you want to tell us a little bit about how that looks from a tax perspective?
Sure, thanks, Amy. And by the way, this is sort of designed to be an open session, so I think there's a mic roving around. If there's anyone's got any questions along the way, please feel free to raise your hand. Put us on the spot. So for most people that come to see me and they're starting out in games, one of the early steps is formation of the team. And we often do that via a company structure, which is a very common arrangement you see in business these days. Most people sort of get into that space because they're looking to limit their liability, potentially look at ways in which they can sort of consolidate IP into one particular bucket. Creates a really easy vehicle that people understand and can be a proxy for the operations of a title in particular. But ideally, is the seed that creates a studio. And I'm big on that emphasis about the fact that people typically start out with a title in mind, but sustainability in the industry is really about that future direction and bringing together a team so that you can work on projects in a cycle and hopefully reach a cadence where there's commerciality involved.
Yeah, I find it interesting. A lot of developers sort of reach out to me in the first instance, which is a good thing, sort of getting prepared. But more often than not, I tend to direct people towards LDB or accountants to kind of get their structure set up. And the reason for that is that the company structure that most people kind of use is very useful for managing IP, but it's also a tax problem and it's a tax concern, and that sort of starts to boil down to what each of the individual shareholders' tax situation looks like. So even though people come to speak to the lawyer first, and that's a good thing to get on top of it, generally the accountant is the best place to start because you have to get that structure right. And it's not just about the company's tax position, it's about the individual shareholders as well. Some people have got trusts, some people don't. There's all sorts of different setups and structures that the individuals within the company have that need to be addressed at the same time. So I always think it's a good move to go speak to the accountant first and get set up and ready for success.
And Luke, if we have a company, does that mean it has to be self-funded investment in the game, or are there other options for that?
Well, typically, when you're setting up a company, that's the initial stage. So that company creates a separate legal entity that can own the IP. And one of the great things about a company is you can then set that up based on how you like the structure to be managed, so that people have different interests and different ownership percentages. So oftentimes it can be a case of having a conversation around, well, I'm going to be doing X amount of hours, I'm going to be putting in the work, and therefore I should be owning, say, a 40% stake in the company, as opposed to someone who's got maybe a lesser interest, and they may have a smaller number of shares or a smaller percentage. The good thing about a company structure is that down the track, as you become more commercialised, people can actually acquire those shares, or in a lot of cases we've seen people take up an interest, so subscribe for new shares and perhaps acquire 20% of the company, injecting funds into the company that everyone benefits from, and that creates the next stages of development.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. You see a lot of teams, this is kind of like a tips and traps for young players, but you see teams kind of coming out of university and there'll be like 7 people that have met at a game jam.
Yeah.
And they're like, we're going to start a company, it's going to be awesome. And then you realise that when it gets boiled down to it, it's like, well, there's 3 people that are going to be working hard, full time. There's one person that's an illustrator that's work is incredible, but is really only going to do something quite minor in the context of the whole development process. And here they are starting a company together. The equity is the same. You're kind of setting yourself up for a bit of a disaster there unless you have a conversation up front about how that's actually going to work, because I think it's just human nature. If one person's working 40 hours a week and somebody's off, down at Bells Beach surfing or something, it's just that imbalance creates a certain type of toxicity within the company that can't really be readily managed. So I think when you're starting out and setting up a company, I think you need to have those kind of frank conversations about roles, responsibilities, time commitments and all those type of things, and don't just get too focused on the idea itself and how cool it is to be a game developer, because these type of conversations need to happen. Otherwise, we see it all the time. Arguments kind of emerge, and then getting equity back from people at a later date can be quite difficult because you need their kind of consent, and if the relationship goes south, then that can be very difficult. So I think, the company is great for the reasons that we've mentioned so far about managing IP and tax and things like that, but it is a very it's a rigid structure that you need to take seriously. So getting advice up front and thinking about these types of issues before you set the company up is kind of critical.
It's definitely the case, that the trap in a way is that you can give shares away and then find that you don't really have a mechanism to
Exactly.
peel them back later on.
Yeah, that's right. And I think this is where the shareholders' agreement, which is not strictly speaking a legal requirement. When you set up a company, you get a constitution, and that speaks to the Corporations Act, and that will allow the company to function moving forward. But a shareholders' agreement is a document that sort of underpins that and overrides it, and it just governs the relationship of the shareholders in a more pragmatic, practical sense. So a constitution, when you set up a company, kind of is almost automated. And it's the same one that you would get for a car mechanic, as you would get for a cafe, as you would get for a game developer. Whereas the shareholders' agreement is where all of the shareholders sit down and think about it and say, right, how do we want to manage this company? How do we raise capital? What happens if somebody wants to leave? How do we get these shares back from these people? And it's a critical document that allows you to, in the best case scenario is that it allows you to have the hard conversations up front, so that when things go south later on or something happens, it doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing either. It can be a good thing. Suddenly you've made a whole heap of money. What do we do with this money? What did we agree to do with this money? I don't know. So if you have those kind of conversations up front, that can get put into the shareholders' agreement. And then in a perfect world, you put the shareholders' agreement once it's signed into a drawer and nobody ever thinks about it again because everybody's getting along swimmingly. But if things go awry, then you've got that there. It's like, this is how we agreed to manage these type of problems. So it's not strictly speaking a legal requirement, but it is a prudent measure to take, I think, for any game dev studio of any size.
It's definitely something we've seen over the years is that having that hard conversation up front while everyone's amicable
absolutely
makes a big difference along the way. And even down to the fact that if you do have a dispute start to occur, people have some confidence that there's a mechanism in place that can deal with it in a constructive manner.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's just thinking through these problems in advance. And most of the time it's like, I just would not have thought to kind of consider that about what happens if somebody, it's a good leaver or a bad leaver. Are they leaving in positive circumstances or negative circumstances? How do we kind of it's things like, if you're a small studio, for example, and somebody wants to leave, well, that person that's leaving can't just sell their shares to anyone because they're a programmer. The company needs a programmer. So, how does that work? What's the process by which you find someone? And I think the shareholders agreement is the best place to kind of articulate those types of strategies.
Speaking of formal documents, so when you incorporate, you get this constitution and it's the rules and guidelines of how you need to operate your business. But there's also some other formal roles, so things such as directors, public officers, secretaries, and then shareholders. Perhaps, Luke, you could tell us what the main difference between a director and a shareholder is from a tax perspective.
Sure. So there's a couple of key sort of issues that stem from those different titles, and they're all really derived from the Corporations Act requirements. So when we talk about shares and share issuance, we're talking about shareholders there. And the shareholder is a person who's essentially subscribing for capital in the company, and to acquire those shares, they tip some money into the company. A director is the one that has the obligation to essentially act in the shoes of the company. So they're the one that puts ink to page on when they're signing a contract, because obviously a company itself is a not fictional but a not physical entity.
Yeah.
So having that director in place, they're the person that has the responsibility of ensuring that ultimately the company follows the right good governance that's in place to try and protect the commercial system and protect the integrity. So as coming with that role comes a number of directors' duties, and those directors' duties are written into the Corporations Act that have some pretty stiff penalties attached to them. So it's important that when you're setting out in business, people that become directors are aware of what the risks are aware of their obligations, things like making sure the company doesn't trade whilst insolvent. That's something that they have to take responsibility for, and someone who maybe isn't as, taking a key interest in those commercial aspects maybe isn't necessarily the right person to be a director.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, one of the main reasons from a legal perspective of setting up a company, and the reason that they exist, is that it sort of de-risks the individual from the pursuit that they're undertaking, the business pursuit. So the company enters into trade and commerce. If something goes bad, then it's the company that kind of suffers, and it's the individual shareholders that, their personal assets, if they're spoken to, got right advice from accountants and so forth, should be protected. However, if you're the director of the company, the Corporations Act provides reach directly to those individuals in the event that they're not acting in the best interests of the company itself. So it's things like, if you're a director of a company and you set up another company that's in direct competition with the one that you're currently running, that's a problem under the Corporations Act, and you can get into trouble for that. And then there's other things too, which, might not be as obvious. So, if it's a requirement to pay superannuation to your staff, for example, if the company doesn't do that, then the director can be personally liable for that sum because that was their responsibility. So, it's not something that you just put your hand up and say, I'll be a director and I can sign off on the contracts. You need to, it is more of a senior sort of role, and you need to really keep your eyes on the road about what's going on inside the company.
So direct equity investment by way of share issuance is usually one of the main ways that a company will start out, and people will often put up their capital first. Another alternative is to get some funding from government agencies such as Film Vic, Screen Australia, Screen Queensland, and the other territories and states. So if we wanted to get external funding, Luke, how would we go about that, and what sort of documentation do we need to apply for, essentially?
There's a lot of bodies are coming to the table now. Obviously, games is a really evolving space, and we're seeing a lot of interest, even from the federal government with the digital games tax offset, but all the various funding bodies in the states have their own different grant application process. It's definitely, each one's a little bit unique, so I don't want to talk necessarily to one in particular. But all of them have a need to sort of put together some cash flow finance or funding and forecasting. So it's a really good idea to sit down and figure out, how you're going to pay people, how you're going to get money in initially. If you do get some grant funding, what are you going to do with that money? What's the best bang for buck? Obviously, starting out, most likely people will be putting into sweat equity, and so they're not necessarily going to be paid themselves for their efforts, but they'll pick that up via their share ownership.
Yeah, I think the other issue there is you've got to be mindful of kind of giving people shares as a form of remuneration. I mean, Luke, you can probably speak to this point a lot more than I can, but that, in essence, becomes a form of payment and is therefore a taxable supply. So you can create a situation in which an individual receives shares but no money, yet the value of those shares is essentially taxable, so that you create a tax trap for yourself where you're actually more out of pocket than if you didn't have the shares in the first place.
Definitely the case. Gavin, you've done a bit of work with some of the various bodies securing funding. What's the legal sign-off look like?
So, look, I think the most important thing, be it Screen Australia, South Australian Film Corporation, Screen Queensland, or any of these bodies, really is that you've got to remember that they're public organisations, so it's public money. And the most important thing to them is ensuring that there isn't some sort of copyright dispute lingering under the hood of the game, because they're in the business of funding projects that can actually see the light of day, right? That's their remit is to government. They need to deliver on that. They need to fund games that actually get released. And if you've got a copyright dispute under the hood of your game, that's probably the fastest, most effective way to ensure that a project won't make it to market, or if it does make it to market, there can be a disaster looming, which could even be a public relations disaster for you if it becomes apparent that you don't own the things that you think you did. And so the main thing for them really is making sure that the IP is completely stitched up, is owned by the applicant entity or individual, depending on whatever case it may be. And so that's where the solicitor's opinion letter, which some of you may have heard of, it's a requirement from pretty much every funding body, and it's essentially a letter from an independent solicitor that's reviewed your game, looked at all the contracts that you've got in place regarding intellectual property, and it's an independent solicitor that reviews that and says, yes, I've looked at this game, all the IP is where it needs to be, and that letter then gets sent to the applicable organisation, and you get sign off that way. So yeah, I think that when you're starting out, you may not have a lot of money and you might be applying to these type of funding organisations. You really need to be super clear on who owns what before you apply, because if you get funding and you receive the money and there is an intellectual property problem, eventually that gets to somebody like me that we have to sort out. Otherwise, I can't sign the opinion, you don't get paid, and you've got to remedy this problem in some other way. So having a conversation with all your contributors and making sure that they're comfortable with IP being assigned to you or your company is kind of paramount, and then you should be fine in managing the relationship with the funding organisation.
So when you receive the funds, Luke, are they taxable to the company, or do I have to pay tax on them?
Yeah, so typically the way in which a company structure works is that it's a separate taxpayer from the individuals. So it's really important to keep that in mind, that individuals are taxed on marginal tax rates, so the more you earn incrementally, the higher the rate of tax. A company's taxed typically at a flat rate of tax. Currently for small business it's 25%. That can work really well in the game space because, as we all know, the revenue trajectory tends to spike and really flatline, so you can create some really lumpy revenue pieces where expenditure arrives all in one area and then revenue's arriving in a different tax period. So having that flat rate of tax is really important. Grants aren't really any different. They're derived in the course of carrying on the business, and so they become taxable income. The key issue becomes one of timing there. So we're really focused around the milestones and what triggers the release of a particular stage of a grant, and have a look at whether we can tie that into particular patterns of expenditure. If we're able to earmark, say, the incurring of salaries or particular direct costs that would ordinarily be deductible, the revenue can offset those deductions, and the resulting position, ideally, is flat, or there's no taxable income, and so no tax is paid. So tax is paid on income less deductions.
Yeah, I think it's that's another reason too why a company is a useful structure. If you apply to Vic Screen as an individual, then that revenue is attributed to you personally. So that's a taxable supply that you personally will have to kind of pay. So yeah, I think that's just another reason why a company structure is a good idea. It just sort of makes more things deductible in that sense, and you can sort of better manage the cash flow.
It's definitely the case, and certainly in the context of the tax rate, particularly in a successful release,
that's right,
only paying tax at 25 cents on the dollar can make a big difference to what you're able to hang on to and reinvest into future releases.
Yeah, absolutely.
And with the funding, is it ever repayable? Do you ever have to make a repayment?
No, not anymore. Like back in the old days, when I started out working with Film Vic, we got into some fierce arguments about the rate at which they had to be paid back. But it's become a lot more kind of streamlined. I mean, even 10 years ago, the contracts from Film Vic were half an inch thick, and now they're about 3 pages. So they've certainly streamlined the contract over the years, but generally not. No, it's not repayable.
So in terms of external investment, publishing agreements and licensing agreements are pretty common types of advances, essentially. What sort of types have you seen, Cam, of those particular agreements?
Yeah, so I mean, publishing is often a really good way to kind of get some revenue up front, and also support in various places too. So, publishers will often provide sort of localization assistance, testing assistance in the form of QA, marketing assistance, and a few other things like that. So I think going down the publishing route is definitely something to look into, particularly if they can pay in advance and assist in getting the game kind of funded. You've got to be mindful though, because there's publishers and then there's publishers. So there's a whole host of different types of publishers out there, and it's important not to just kind of sign on the dotted line because a publisher shows interest in you. I mean, if you've got a party game and the publisher is an iOS publisher from China, then that's probably not going to help you a great deal, even if they promise you the world. So it's important to sort of look at the publisher's track record around the type of games that they publish. Do they understand the indie space? Do they understand the type of game that you're making? Have they got a track record in that area? And think about that, because it's not just about the dollars and cents. This is an ongoing relationship. It'll generally kind of last, between 5 and 10 years, and more or less be for the life of the game. And, without wanting to sort of sound too cynical about it, often the name of the game for publishers is to sign up as many game developers and games as they can, put a bit of energy under each one of these games and see which one rises to the top. And when they find the one that rises to the top, they drop the rest of them and throw all their resources under that one game, because it's a tough industry and they're trying to they've got to secure their bets. So in the context of a publisher approaches you, if they're not offering in advance, if they don't have a track record in the type of game that you're doing, if you can't sort of see what type of marketing skills that they've actually got, you need to think about, is this really the right fit? Am I just signing this publishing agreement because they're a publisher and it's kind of, this is what game developers do? You have to be very kind of mindful of that and think about what your specific needs are and see if that publisher can address those needs. But certainly, back to your point, Amy, if you are looking for budget and a publisher can come forward and put up an advance to assist in that, and that can sometimes complement resources that you've got from other places. So if you've got funding from Vic Screen, for example, you can go speak to a publisher and your project will look more appealing, because you'll say, well, I've already got X 100,000 in place. All I need is this final piece, and we can produce this game to a kind of a AA or AAA standard. That's far more appealing. But so you need to look at the relationship holistically, understand that it's going to be an ongoing relationship for a long period of time. It's not just about the money now, it's about the relationship moving forward. So yeah, really look at it objectively and think about the needs of your game.
And Luke, from a tax perspective, obviously a lot of the publishers are overseas. How does that translate to Australian tax law and having a company here?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting one. A little bit like the grant side of things, we're really focused around milestones and deliverables, so making sure that we get the timing on it, because often these agreements involve a lot of money up front to help get the game off the ground, and so we're really trying to essentially tie that into, almost in effect, it's a pre-sale, but it's certainly a commitment from the publisher that the company is going to produce a title. So we do focus on the milestones, making sure that we're matching costs to revenue, and ideally that revenue recognition piece initially should zero out. The challenge that comes afterwards is, once you've got a commercial release, is often these agreements come with some form of royalty arrangement. I'll use the term royalty. I think oftentimes it's sort of more pitched along a revenue share type model, but something to be really mindful of. Royalties from a tax perspective are a bit of a unique beast, but it's actually quite exhaustive, the description, almost as if they designed the system to cover as much as possible. And royalties have withholding tax applicable to them. So if you, as an Australian company, make a payment to, someone in the US, there's a double tax agreement that sits between Australia and the US that covers off how that payment can be made and who has taxing priority amongst the jurisdictions. It's getting very heavy really quickly. But the main thing to be aware of is the fact that you may have an obligation to withhold from that payment and remit that money to the Australian Tax Office, even though it is the money for, say, a US publisher, for example. So it's really important that your agreement considers the way in which that arrangement is set up. If it is going to be a royalty, ideally it's documenting the fact that is the case and that there therefore is a ability for the payment to have withholding tax applied and remitted to the ATO. If you don't do that, what you'll find is you'll still bear the obligation of that tax. We've got a question from...
While we're talking about royalties and withholding tax, do you find if the publisher is providing an advance into the budget that often the advance gets caught up with withholding tax complications?
I think everyone heard that, hopefully.
Are you able to just repeat it for the recording?
Yeah, sure. So the money that's inbound, so when the publisher generates or raises the money and pays that across to you, will withholding tax apply to the money that's coming into you? And it's a really interesting question because we have seen both sides of it. Typically, we see it more as an advance funding, so it's a prepayment or of sales, or sometimes the agreements are structured more on like a loan type arrangement with a recoupment after the fact. And in that case, withholding tax typically doesn't apply. I have had the unfortunate experience, it was quite a significant arrangement, it was about $4 million, and with one of the larger EU-based organisations, and they identified after the fact that they thought that withholding tax should apply, and because they wore the risk, they withheld 10%, so it cut $400K out of the expected monies coming in, which was a bit of a surprise.
Ouch, yeah.
Yeah, it made it a bit hard to make their budget.
Yeah, I mean, just on that, and even sort of before you get to the withholding tax kind of component and talking about royalties, the thing that underpins that really is the definition of net revenue. Like you've got, it's not just sales come back to they come back to you via the agreed split. There's often like deductions that the publisher will take out, things like marketing expenses, QA expenses, localization costs that sort of come off the top. And so that definition of net revenue sort of becomes one of the chief battlegrounds on these publishing agreements. And if you're dealing with the top end of town, so for example, Disney, their definition of net revenue runs to almost a full A4 page in terms of its deductions and things like that. And you can be really kind of shorthand with it and just say costs. But once you sort of mine into those types of things, you can really kind of get into the weeds around what types of things can be deducted. So it's important to think about that even before you think about the tax perspective, because a good definition that's in your favour of games net revenue can really kind of put things back in your favour, notwithstanding the fact that the actual percentage split might not look so great. So, a 35 kind of 65 split might look good on paper, but if you've got a terrible definition of net revenue where they can deduct almost every expense under the sun, including things like internal costs, internal marketing expenses, which isn't even actually an expense, it's just them attributing a cost to something, that the actual balance of the cash sitting there can be negatively impacted. So it's worth spending some time on that, and that's even before you get to the tax piece.
And generally speaking, when you have those royalty repayments or the repayments back, who calculates how much it is?
Well, generally, the publisher will be the person that's kind of is actually kind of receiving the cash, and so that's when it sort of starts to become important that you've got things like audit clauses in your publisher's agreement, which allows you to kind of once every 12 months have a look at the books and make sure you're not being sort of shortchanged. That's one thing that we always try and include.
Yeah, so it's pretty common to actually just receive a remittance with an amount and here you go, this is the amount, and then you've got to figure out how it came to be. So it is important from a legal perspective.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the more kind of, I think, the thing that I often see with publishers' agreements in particular is that they'll be very one-sided arrangements. It's all about what you as the developer are doing for the publisher. And if you actually read through the publishing agreement, you're like, what are they actually on the hook for here? There's a loose arrangement where they're going to provide marketing assistance, they're going to do a bit of this, they're going to do a bit of that. And so, the main thing that I try and do when I'm dealing with one of these types of agreements is to put them on the hook to actually do things. I mean, that example that I was giving before about how they put a little bit of energy under a bunch of games, we want to make sure that your game is the one that they're putting the energy under. And the best way to do that is to actually get some commitments from them in the publishing agreement itself. So, that's where I try and do it. And that sort of feeds through to what Amy's saying. Sometimes you get these remittance forms and you're like, well, okay, that's an amount of money, but what is this? What's the bigger piece of the picture? How much of this is actually a deduction? How can I verify that these are legitimate expenses? So, that's one thing to keep in mind, I think.
So when we're talking about putting them on the book, what kinds of terms or details would you be starting to suss out when talking to the publisher?
That's a good question. Just asking about when we try and put the publishers on the hook, what type of terms do we actually include in the contract? You'll find that it's quite tricky to do, unfortunately. I try and put like a dollar commitment down. Okay, you can do marketing spend. All right, is it $50,000? Is it $100,000? They're able to kind of commit to the amount of the advance. So why can't we commit to a dollar amount in terms of advertising as well? So, those types of hard objective kind of things would be my strategy. And then, try and avoid things like where they say, marketing support, like what does that actually mean? Do they have people? Do they engage a third party? What do the expenses look like around that? And just sort of cross-examine them a little bit about the imputations that they've got included in their contract, because often, it's just their standard form. They send it out to every developer. For you, this might be your only game or one of only a few games. It's very important to you. You need to take it, quite seriously and make sure that it is really the right fit for you.
And so, Luke, the grants that we spoke about, they were taxable coming in. If you have a publishing agreement and it's recoupable and you've essentially got to repay it, does that mean the income's taxable as well, or...?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting one. We saw for a long while a lot of these publishing arrangements were almost like a sort of a pre-sale, if you will, or a release of funds on the back of expected sales. And in that case, we certainly expect them to be more of a revenue type nature. On the back of that, then the repayments back to the publisher, if they're sort of more of a funding arrangement, tend to be more capital repayments. But what we're probably seeing these days is fewer and fewer of those sorts of arrangements, and they're stripping it back maybe a little bit, like you were saying, Cam. It's very simple, just straight percentages.
Yeah, that's right. I think we're starting to see, I've definitely noticed a trend of what I call sort of publishing light deals that are emerging. And it's publishers that really, they've just kind of given up on the vague promises around marketing and so forth. And they just supply the money. It's just a bank. And, if you were to go to the bank and say, we want to borrow against our IP, the red tape that you would have to go through if you could even find a bank that would be prepared to do it.
Probably won't.
You're just not going to find one. And so that's sort of the publisher fills that void. But really, that's all it is. They're just lending you the money against the IP on future kind of sales. And sometimes, that's all you need. Like depending on the type of game, if you've got a really clear strategy that you're trying to hit, you don't necessarily need a publisher to come in and promise the world in terms of marketing and give you a massive stand at Gamescom or something like that. You just, again, it sort of boils down to thinking about what you need. But there is definitely an emergence of these type of publishing light deals now, which can be quite lucrative and useful.
So one of the other types of investment, I guess, is development agreements, which are more driven by different platforms. Can you explain, Luke, how that might look?
Yeah, so we're starting to see quite a lot of funding arrangements coming out of the big players, typically for things like Game Pass and those different areas where they're looking for content for their games as a service platforms, and they're often quite lucrative. I think in a way typically it's almost more of a case of a work for hire type arrangement where the developer's actually getting that funding, gets their foot in the door, they can build their team around that and get a commercial release to get a name for themselves. Often then the revenue stream that's coming in after release is shrunken down, it's a lot smaller. And again, we've got the same sort of issues there around milestone recognition and when that taxation occurs, we tend to, again, try and focus it down to what are the particular steps in the contract and when can we tie revenue to expenditure to make sure that there's a real matching up of incoming money and outgoing money.
Got a few questions. Yes?
Yeah.
Have you found any institutions in Australia that are happy to fund the offset?
That's a good question. So the question is anybody out there prepared to loan against the offset in the game space? I can tell you that there's a number of people that are interested. I've got a few meetings this week, actually. That's kind of like a bit of a hot topic, so we'll see. In terms of, there's nobody that has actually done it, of course, because it's all so new, but then you've got companies like Fulcrum Media, for example, that are very well established in the film industry, and I imagine they're going to take an interest in it. I mean, the interesting thing for me around that is just how many companies are going to be in a position to actually borrow against it, just because of where that threshold lies. We're sort of starting to drift into a different topic here, but that's definitely watch this space. I think that lenders will emerge for sure.
Yeah, if you want to come and talk about it more, we're doing a talk on it tomorrow. But it is really interesting because, we don't know a lot yet about what the finished product's going to look like. But you would imagine that it would be very similar to film.
Yeah, that's right. Sorry.
Could you speak to a little bit about IP ownership rights and contracts, and if you see any publishers trying to get that, if it's standard, if, under no circumstances ever should you sign away anything to do with that?
Yeah, well, look, it's a good question. I think, one thing, we're talking about the funding bodies before, and we're talking about the importance of IP for the funding bodies. I mean, to a certain extent, that's just good business, right? You've got to own the stuff that you purport to. So a lot of the stuff, the commitments that you're making to a funding body will be the same as the ones that you're making to a publisher, right? I think one of the tricks that you get from the publisher, though, will be they kind of go for these 360 deals where they get all rights of any kind of description, whether or not they actually need them or not. So if if you're approaching a publisher and you're speaking to this publisher in China because you want to distribute in China, like, why would you give them the film rights to the IP? And that's the type of stuff that will be included in the standard definition. So you've got to be really mindful of that. I think the important thing to remember with IP is that you can really shave it down into whichever way. You can limit it in a number of different ways. You can limit it by location. You can limit it by duration. You can limit it by type. So you might have one person that you've got a relationship to do PlayStation. You'll have a relationship with Sony. You'll have a different relationship for iOS, for example. So when you sign these publishers agreements, don't just give away the whole box and dice because they ask for it. And I think that's where it starts to come into play. If they're not offering much of an advance, for example, then you take certain rights off the table. So you've got to use these elements to kind of leverage things in your favour. But it's a good question. Yeah, IP can be used and managed in a number of different ways, and don't just give it away because somebody asks.
Was there any other questions while we've got the mic roving around? Just one down the front.
Going back to the formation or raising capital for early stage companies, how do you arrive at a valuation of what the company's worth if you haven't made anything yet or you're about to?
That's a really good question. It's I wish I had the answer to that in a way, because a lot
secret
of
accounting magic, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of studios will tend to build a model around what they're trying to release. They'll build their budget, so it's almost, you want to go bottom up, would be my recommendation, and say, okay, well, here's what we're going to put in, here's the costs of actually getting to a release, here's what we're looking to finance, and then once we've done that, here's the finished product, and this is where we expect it to sit within the market. So focusing in on that seems to be the most successful approach. But yeah, look, it's going to be a real struggle, particularly for a small startup studio, until they've got some runs on the board. You don't typically see a lot of sort of external parties coming to the table unless one of the participants got that sort of history of a really successful release. Yeah.
Was there any other questions on the floor there? One up in there.
Especially for games, it's quite common for people overseas to contract their work, and I'm wondering if you're in Australia and you're hiring someone overseas to do work for you as a contractor, it's usually the contractor's obligation to pay that tax, right? But I'm wondering, how does the ATO even chase up the tax from people overseas?
So typically from a tax perspective, if a contractor's working in a different tax jurisdiction and they're delivering the work there, they'd be taxable in that jurisdiction, so they won't have any Australian tax obligation. Even down to things like superannuation won't necessarily apply. There's one area to be mindful of, and that is employment arrangements. So if you are employing someone in a different jurisdiction, you may have an obligation to register in that jurisdiction as an employer there, and deal with their local laws in regard to things like superannuation, minimum work standards and the like. So it's worth being aware of that. What we see mostly in that sort of arrangement though is more contracting type arrangements where the counterparty is a business, so it's B2B.
So even if like the money is, you're paying them Australian money, it's still like their.
Typically that's right, yeah.
They have to do whatever, like it's not up to you to.
It's not on you, no,
Okay,
no.
cool.
It's only really if you're under an employment arrangement. There is a need to identify the party and make sure that you've got the right credentials in place. That's probably the main thing.
So do they need to register like an ABN or something, or it's just their own?
No, so if they're international party, they won't qualify for an Australian business number.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So it generally comes down to where they're actually carrying out the work. So if they're carrying out the work overseas in Asia or the US, that's where their taxing will be, and that's where it will happen. So it won't affect you on this side in Australia.
But yeah, I think just reiterating Luke's point, you've got to be mindful because it is starting to become more prevalent that individuals overseas can be considered an employee. And it's like, I don't know what the public holidays are in Canada. Like, how do you stay on top of that stuff? So you've got to be really mindful. And particularly at the moment where more remote workforces, you could have people in New Zealand, Canada, here, there and everywhere. And yeah, you've just got to be really careful about how they're categorised. So if they're working what is essentially looks like a full-time job, 38 hours a week type situation, they're individuals. Well, they're employees, and you have to look into what the obligations you owe to those people in their jurisdiction.
Just because you want them to be a contractor doesn't necessarily mean that's the case.
That's right, yeah.
I think we had another question in the middle there.
So for a development studio to raise capital, right, there are largely three sources from what I'm seeing. There's grants, there's venture capital money, and there is publishing money, right, but which comes with its own set of exploitative terms. Now, between these, what is the smartest form of capital that can be sourced for a studio at the early stage, considering the kind of support that a studio might require from the business and from the gaming side, and also the terms that actually provide them the right kind of guidance and lucrative monetization opportunities long-term for the stake that they still own over time?
Well, I mean, look, it depends on the needs of the team, I think. I mean, it probably depends on how sophisticated you are. Everybody's situation is kind of different. You might have a company kind of set up and, you might be looking for an investment in the team to grow the team versus investment in the game to build the game. You've got to think about what the actual needs are that you're trying to address, I think. So kind of a difficult one to answer, except on quite broad terms, with the one caveat that, money is good if you can get it. Entertain that conversation until it becomes kind of untenable. But yeah, at the same time, don't just give everything away either. So yeah, you've got to be
shares,
smart.
I think they're the main ones, because a development agreement, if the project doesn't proceed, then the agreement's not worth anything. But if you have given away shares, then you're stuck with that. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. June.
I know that the ATO is quite strict on that employment. If it looks like employment, it is employment.
Yeah.
Do you see that in other jurisdictions as well?
Yes, and I said Canada before, kind of wasn't saying that flippantly. They're red hot on this. And this is why you see services like remote.com have kind of emerged. They're like these international HR companies, and they just manage that process for you. I mean, it's probably quite an expensive service unless you're of a certain size.
It is, yeah.
But it really takes the heartache out of that because, I know a few of my clients have been kind of caught up in that. And it's the type of thing that you only find out about retrospectively, So it's like, oh, I've been paying this person for 6 months. Now I realise that I owe them holiday pay and they should have had, whatever, Canada's National Day off, or these types of considerations that we're just not across. So, yeah.
There is an interesting one with the whole pandemic side of things that New Zealand actually pivoted because they found that a lot of people were actually staying in New Zealand because they were, trapped there. And so they've adjusted a lot of their tax system to allow parties to employ in New Zealand, but the person who wears a lot of the responsibility is actually the employee to withhold tax and deal with super and the like. So there's some rules around that, but it's, yeah, I wonder whether it will change over time.
Might just have one more question, or we have to wrap up. One more question.
Most publication agreements obviously happen either prior to development starting or in the early stages of active development. My team is in a situation where development's basically finished and we're so we have a full-on marketable product. Is this a particularly unusual situation to be looking for a publisher in terms of the marketing funding and connections and that sort of thing? Is that particularly unusual?
No, I think people kind of approach publishers at all stages, and publishers will be open to those types of conversations. But in your kind of context, it's like, what do you want from a publisher? Do you need that marketing support? Because you might be able to just buy that if you've got revenue. This is the thing. I think if you go to a publisher with a game that's finished and is looking good, like, where do we sign, kind of thing. It seems like a pretty low risk bet for them. So again, it boils down to looking at what you actually kind of need from the publisher and making sure that they're capable of delivering on that promise.
Yeah, thanks. So in this kind of situation more broadly, I suppose, given the lower risk, you'd be looking at slightly different, probably more favourable terms in those agreements. Yeah,
I would say that you wouldn't be looking for an advance because the advance would just sort of disappear. You're looking probably for a more favourable royalty split, closer to 50-50 if possible, and then a commitment to do kind of marketing, and then other things too, like community management and stuff like that they can have individuals be involved to manage the Discord and things like that too. So I think, you can get quite granular with this stuff, like speak to them about what you specifically think you need and see whether or not they can deliver on that. That would be my advice.
Great, thank you very much.
So I think that might wrap us up for today. So Luke and Cam will be here for a few minutes outside the front. Obviously, if we can exit the room for the next people, that would be great. But Luke and Cam will be around for a little bit. And thank you all for coming, and thank you all for listening.
Thanks, everyone.